Every Tuesday morning, she knocked my trash can flat. I never said a word. Neighbors thought I just had bad luck with wind. Deborah smiled at every HOA meeting like nothing happened. Then I installed something under that lid. Something with a memory card and a very short fuse. Deborah's smile started slipping by the second Tuesday. What that camera caught wasn't just her. It was everything. My name is Mara Ellison. 34. A single mom raising 2 kids in a beige 2-story on Willowbrook Lane. I moved to Willow Creek Estates for the good schools and the promise of quiet cul-de-sac evenings. I worked remote in accounting, kept my yard tidy, and mostly stayed out of neighborhood politics. Deborah Prescott ran our HOA board like a small kingdom. She'd lived here 19 years, knew every bylaw by heart, and treated compliance letters like personal correspondence. Most neighbors avoided her. I tried to be polite. I'd soon learn was the exact weakness she was counting on. The Willow Creek Estates HOA newsletter arrived monthly, thick with rules about mailbox paint shades and approved shrub heights. Deborah edited every issue herself. She'd underline violations in red ink before residents even opened their mail. People joked about it quietly, always checking over their shoulder first. I'd met Deborah properly at a welcome dinner 2 years back. She complimented my curtains, then mentioned my porch light wattage exceeded code. I laughed, assuming she was kidding. She wasn't. An official notice appeared, taped neatly to my front door. Her husband, Frank, owned Prescott Waste Solutions. The company contracted for our neighborhood's bulk trash pickup. Nobody questioned the arrangement outwardly, though a few residents whispered about how conveniently every violation seemed to circle back to trash cans, storage sheds, or curb clutter. Deborah's teenage son, Tyler, filmed everything for his social media channel Bike Tricks, skate ramps, neighborhood drama. He always seemed to be somewhere nearby with his phone up, capturing footage nobody asked for. I didn't think much of it then. That would change. My next-door neighbor, Priya Anand, was a retired paralegal who'd tangled with Deborah before over a fence height dispute. She warned me early on. "Keep records," she said. "Deborah doesn't forget. And she definitely doesn't forgive." I nodded, not yet understanding how right she was. Every Thursday was trash day. I set my can out the night before, exactly where the guidelines specified, 18 inches from the curb. Lid closed. No visible bags. Deborah walked her poodle past my house every single Thursday morning at 7:15, precisely on schedule. The first time I found my trash can tipped over, bags spilled across the lawn, I blamed raccoons. Wind. Maybe. I cleaned it up before the kids woke for school, annoyed but unbothered. These things happened in every neighborhood. I didn't connect it to anyone specific. It happened again the following Thursday. Then the one after that. Always while I was inside making breakfast. Always cleaned up before I could catch whoever or whatever was responsible. My son started calling it the trash ghost. Priya mentioned she'd seen Deborah's poodle sniffing around my can once. Deborah standing close by, phone in hand. "Probably nothing," Priya said, though her tone suggested otherwise. I filed the comment away, still not ready to believe my HOA president would bother with something so petty. Meanwhile, official notices kept arriving at my door. A improperly stored garden hose, a non-compliant welcome mat color, A visible clutter citation for my kids' bikes leaned against the garage. Each one signed by Deborah Prescott, board president. In her looping, deliberate signature, I paid the small fines without contest. Fighting Deborah in front of the board felt exhausting, and I had 2 kids, a full-time job, and exactly 0 patience for neighborhood theater. Looking back, that exhaustion was precisely what she banked on. Compliance was easier than conflict. At the spring HOA meeting, Deborah proposed a new ordinance requiring all residents to install approved trash enclosures, sold exclusively through a certified vendor. She didn't mention the vendor by name. I later learned it was a shell company registered to Frank's business partner. The proposal passed by a narrow vote. Most residents too tired to object. I raised my hand, asking why enclosures were suddenly mandatory when nothing in our original covenant mentioned them. Deborah smiled thinly. Standards evolve, Mara. Try to keep up with the times. That comment got a few uncomfortable laughs from the room. I sat down, cheeks burning, aware that Deborah had just made an example of me in front of 40 neighbors. Priya squeezed my hand under the table. She's building a case against you, she whispered. Watch yourself. I didn't understand what Priya meant until the fines started multiplying. Every week brought a new violation notice, each one increasingly specific, increasingly strange. Trash can position 6 degrees off recommended angle. I actually laughed out loud reading that one. Alone in my kitchen. The trash can incidents grew more frequent too, twice weekly now. Sometimes contents strewn halfway down the street. My son found a half-eaten muffin wrapper from a bakery 3 neighborhoods overtangled in our hedge. I thought. We never shopped there. I started setting my alarm earlier, hoping to catch whoever was responsible in the act. Every time, I arrived at the window seconds too late, trash already scattered, street already empty, Deborah's poodle already 3 houses down, tail wagging innocently in the morning light. Frustration built quietly inside me. Not rage. Not yet. Just a simmering, persistent unease that something deliberate was happening and nobody around me wanted to say it plainly. I mentioned it to my sister on a phone call. Sounds targeted, she said. Get proof. That word, proof, stuck with me. I wasn't the type to confront people without evidence. I'd spent my career in accounting because I trusted numbers, documentation, timestamps. If someone was doing this on purpose, I decided I'd need something undeniable. Something they couldn't smile their way out of. I didn't know yet how far this would go, that a tipped-over trash can would eventually unravel a scheme involving fake citations, a rigged vendor contract, and a woman who'd spent 19 years convincing an entire neighborhood that her word was law. But it started there, small and quiet. I finally caught a glimpse one Thursday, half-dressed, coffee in hand, peering through the blinds at 6:50. A shadow moved near my can. By the time I got my shoes on and reached the door, the shadow was gone. The can already tipped sideways. This time, though, I found something new. A small business card wedged under my mailbox flag, embossed with Prescott Waste Solutions, premium enclosure installation. My stomach tightened. Coincidence felt increasingly unlikely.
I photographed the card and tucked it into
I decided to speak with Deborah directly, hoping a calm conversation might resolve things before I made accusations I couldn't take back. I walked to her house that afternoon, rehearsing polite, neutral phrasing the entire way. Her garden looked immaculate, predictably so. She answered on the second knock. "Mara," she said, all warmth, as if we hadn't just exchanged tense words at the last meeting. I explained the trash can pattern, keeping my tone light. Her expression didn't flicker. "Raccoons, dear. This whole neighborhood has a raccoon problem. Very persistent creatures." I mentioned the business card. Her smile tightened just slightly, a fraction most people wouldn't have caught. "Must have blown from somewhere," she said smoothly. "Frank leaves those everywhere. Free advertising." I thanked her for her time and walked home feeling more unsettled than before. That night, I set up a cheap motion sensor camera from a hardware store, aimed loosely at my driveway from the window. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was a start. I told myself I was probably wrong, probably paranoid, probably about to feel silly reviewing raccoon footage. Thursday came. Evening. Hands unsteady. The angle was poor, half obscured by my own porch railing, but I could make out a figure crouching near the can, moving with quick, practiced motions. Not a raccoon. In a familiar quilted jacket. I couldn't confirm the face, not clearly enough to be certain in a way that would hold up if I said something publicly. But the jacket looked exactly like the one Deborah wore walking her poodle every single morning. My hands trembled as I saved the file 3 times over. I brought the footage to Priya first, wanting a second opinion before doing anything rash. She watched it twice, jaw tight. "That's her stride," she said flatly. "I've watched that woman walk past my house for 12 years. I'd know that walk anywhere." My stomach dropped. Still, grainy footage of a jacket wasn't proof enough to bring before the board. Deborah would laugh it off, spin it, maybe even accuse me of harassment. I needed something undeniable, clear footage, clear face, clear intent. I started planning something more permanent, more thorough. The next HOA notice arrived days later, a formal warning for unauthorized surveillance equipment installed without board approval, citing my hardware store camera specifically. Deborah had noticed it. Somehow, within one single trash day, she already knew exactly what I'd set up and where. That detail bothered me more than the notice itself. How had she seen a small camera angled from behind my porch railing unless she'd been close enough, and looking carefully enough, to spot it? I started to suspect this wasn't casual mischief. It was calculated, deliberate, and personal. I called the local hardware store's security section, this time asking about weatherproof options with better night vision and cloud backup, something less obvious than my last attempt. The clerk, overhearing my story, chuckled. "Karen problem. Huh? We sell a lot of these lately. You're not alone." That comment stuck with me. I started paying closer attention at the mailbox cluster, at the community Facebook group, at grocery store small talk. Slowly, quietly, I realized several neighbors had similar stories, bins tipped, notices multiplying, always right after minor pushback against Deborah. Mr. 2 streets over, had gone through nearly the same pattern the previous spring before eventually moving out entirely, exhausted by fines and unexplained yard damage. His wife told me, over coffee, that Deborah had personally recommended their replacement family before their house even sold. A pattern emerged in my mind, one I didn't want to believe. harass residents quietly, escalate through official-looking fines, wear people down until they either complied fully or left. And Frank's business, conveniently, profited either way from enclosure sales or from new move-in landscaping contracts. I brought this theory to Priya, half expecting her to tell me I was overreaching. Instead, she pulled a thick folder from her hallway closet, years of her own documentation, complaints, timestamps, photos. "I've been building this since the fence dispute," she said.
I just needed...
2 women, 2 folders, 1 growing suspicion. We agreed to keep it quiet for now, gathering evidence rather than confronting Deborah directly again. Going public too early, without something airtight, would only give her time to cover her tracks or paint us as bitter, unstable neighbors. I ordered a new camera that week. Small, weatherproof, disguised inconspicuously, with a live app feed and solid night vision. It arrived Monday, where I planned to install it, or exactly how deliberately it would be positioned this time. Thursday was 3 days away. I spent that stretch quietly documenting every notice, every fine, every odd detail I could recall, building a timeline stretching back nearly a year. Whatever Deborah thought she was dealing with, I decided she had badly underestimated who she was up against. I mounted the new camera directly onto the trash can lid itself, hidden inside a fake reflector housing I found online, marketed for exactly this purpose. The angle covered the can, the walkway, and a decent slice of the street beyond. I tested it twice before Thursday. Thursday morning, I stayed in the kitchen instead of the window, sipping coffee, forcing myself to act normal. My phone buzzed at 7:18, motion detected. My hands shook as I opened the live feed, half expecting another blurry raccoon, half expecting something far worse. The footage showed Deborah clearly this time, kneeling beside my can, poodle leash looped around her wrist, deliberately unlatching the lid and tipping the entire container sideways with a practiced shove. She glanced around once, then continued down the sidewalk like nothing had happened. I sat frozen at my kitchen table, coffee cooling, watching the 10-second clip on repeat. There she was, undeniable, unmistakable, in full daylight. 19 years of neighborhood authority. And here was proof she'd been personally sabotaging a single mother's garbage cans for petty, calculated reasons. I didn't confront her immediately. Priya advised patience. "One clip isn't a pattern," she reminded me. "Get more." Claim it was a one-time slip or some misunderstanding. I forced myself to wait, though every instinct screamed to march straight to her door. The following week brought another notice, this one threatening a formal lien against my property for repeated unresolved violations, citing accumulated fines now totaling over $600. My stomach turned reading the number. That kind of money mattered enormously to a single-income household. I called the HOA management company listed on the letterhead, hoping for a neutral third party. The representative sounded tired, overworked, admitting most enforcement decisions ran directly through board president discretion. Deborah, apparently, held far more unilateral power than any actual bylaw technically allowed. At the next board meeting, I requested 5 minutes to address the disproportionate fines against my property. Deborah, chairing as always, glanced at her agenda and said pleasantly, "We're quite full tonight, Mara." Perhaps submit your concerns in writing for next month's session instead. The room, roughly 30 neighbors deep, shifted uncomfortably. A few people exchanged glances I couldn't quite read. Sympathy, maybe, or simple relief it wasn't their turn under scrutiny. I sat back down, jaw tight, resisting the urge to pull out my phone right there. Priya leaned over. "Closure vote finalizes," she whispered. "Once that mandate passes fully, every fine becomes retroactively justified under new bylaws. She's protecting the timeline, not dodging you specifically." The strategy behind it chilled me more than the rudeness had. Walking to my car afterward, I noticed Tyler, Deborah's son, filming the parking lot with his phone, panning slowly across license plates and faces, narrating quietly for whatever channel he ran. He caught my eye briefly, lowered the phone, then raised it again once I'd passed. At home, I searched Tyler's channel out of curiosity. Most videos were skateboarding, harmless teenage content. But buried in the uploads sat a video titled "Neighborhood Karen?" Poking fun at some unrelated resident. The comments section revealed Tyler occasionally filmed HOA drama for views. An idea started forming, small and distant, though I pushed it aside for now. Confronting Deborah through her own son's content felt manipulative, and I wasn't ready to involve a teenager in something this messy. Still, I filed the observation away with everything else. The following Thursday, my camera caught Deborah again, this time accompanied by a second act, tucking a folded flyer into my neighbor's mailbox flag before crossing the street toward my property. I zoomed the footage later, curious what the flyer actually said. Priya intercepted a copy from her own mailbox the next morning. It read, "Community members deserve transparency about non-compliant households," listing addresses, including mine, under a header reading "Repeat offenders." No official HOA seal, no signature, printed on plain cardstock from a home printer. Deborah was running an unofficial smear campaign, distributing anonymous flyers alongside her official notices, quietly turning neighbors against specific households without ever technically putting her name on the accusation. It was clever, deniable, and devastatingly effective among people already primed to trust her. My daughter came home from school upset that week, saying another girl mentioned overhearing her mom call our family the messy house on Willowbrook, 8 years old, and already absorbing the fallout from a manufactured reputation I hadn't earned and couldn't easily disprove to anyone. That night I cried in the bathroom, quietly, so the kids wouldn't hear. Not from the fines, not even from Deborah's schemes directly, but from watching my daughter internalize shame over garbage cans she'd never once touched. Something in me hardened after that, resolute and cold. I reached out to a local attorney the next morning, a friend of Priya's who handled small property disputes on the side. He reviewed my footage and fines over video call, nodding slowly. "You've got harassment here. Likely fraud in the enclosure vendor arrangement too," he warned, though that pursuing formal legal action would take months and considerable money I didn't have readily available. "Your best leverage," he suggested, "is exposure. Boards like this survive on secrecy. Pull that curtain back publicly, and often the legal pressure sorts itself out faster." Exposure. My plans differently than legal threats had. I started researching Deborah's history more thoroughly, searching old neighborhood forums, archived community newsletters from before she moved to Willow Creek Estates 9 years earlier, back when she'd lived somewhere else entirely. I found a single forum thread, half abandoned, from a neighborhood 2 states over. Commenters referenced a Deb P. removed from a previous HOA board following an investigation into vendor kickbacks involving landscaping contracts. The thread ended abruptly. Comments locked. No further explanation given anywhere. I couldn't confirm it was definitely her. Not with certainty, but the pattern matched too precisely to dismiss as coincidence. Petty enforcement, vendor connections, quiet removal, relocation, repeat. Deborah hadn't invented this playbook here. She'd simply perfected it somewhere else first, then brought it with her. Priya wasn't surprised when I shared the thread. People like her don't reform, she said. They relocate. New reputation, same tricks, until someone finally catches on and does something about it. Her certainty steadied me, gave the whole mess a clearer shape. The mailman, Gerald, who'd walked our route for over a decade, mentioned one afternoon that he'd delivered an unusual number of official HOA envelopes to my address compared to literally anyone else on the block. Never seen anything like it, he admitted. You must really bother her. Gerald's comment lodged itself somewhere uncomfortable. Bother her. Except exist quietly with 2 kids and an ordinary yard. Whatever Deborah's actual motive was, it clearly ran deeper than trash can angles or hose storage. This had become personal, and I didn't yet know why. I finally understood. Weeks later, flipping through an old community directory Priya kept archived. My house, the one I'd bought 2 years earlier, had previously belonged to a woman named Carol Whitfield, Deborah's former closest friend, until a falling out nobody in the neighborhood ever fully explained. Priya filled in gaps carefully. Carol and Deborah had co-founded the HOA board together, inseparable for years, until Carol apparently discovered something about the vendor contracts and threatened to report it. Carol sold her house abruptly 6 months later and moved across the country entirely. I sat with that information a long while. Deborah wasn't just harassing a random new neighbor over trash etiquette. She was punishing the house itself, symbolically, for having once belonged to someone who'd almost exposed her. I'd simply inherited a grudge I never knew existed. That realization changed everything for me. This wasn't about winning an argument over garbage cans anymore. It was about finally finishing what Carol Whitfield had started years earlier, except this time, I had cameras, timestamps, documentation, and an attorney who believed the case was winnable. Strangely, the trash can incident stopped for nearly 3 weeks straight. My bin sat untouched every Thursday, upright and mundane, as if the entire ordeal had simply resolved itself. I almost let myself believe Deborah had grown tired of the game, or maybe felt embarrassed. Deborah even complimented my new mailbox flowers one morning, walking her poodle past with an unusually warm wave. I waved back cautiously, unsure whether to trust the sudden thaw or brace for whatever came next. Priya remained skeptical the entire time, watching quietly from her porch. She's not done, Priya warned over coffee one afternoon. This is a pause, not a surrender. Women like her regroup. She's probably finalizing the enclosure vote paperwork before her next move. I wanted to believe otherwise, but experience had taught me to trust Priya's instincts by now. I used the quiet stretch productively, organizing my folder chronologically, every fine, every flyer, every camera clip labeled and backed up across 2 separate cloud accounts. Just in case. My attorney friend reviewed the growing file, impressed by how thorough everything had become. My kids enjoyed the calm too, riding bikes freely without me anxiously watching the street for shadows near our bin. My son asked one evening if the trash ghost had finally moved away. I laughed, telling him maybe, though privately I suspected otherwise entirely. A community potluck arrived that weekend, an annual Willow Creek tradition. Deborah hosted, as always, greeting everyone warmly at her immaculate front lawn. I attended reluctantly, mostly for my kids' sake, watching her navigate the crowd with practiced, effortless charm nobody seemed to question. She approached me directly near the dessert table, complimenting my banana bread, asking politely about my job, my kids' school. For a moment, standing there, I almost forgot the folder waiting at home, almost forgot Carol Whitfield's name, almost let myself relax into simple neighborliness. Then Tyler wandered past, filming candid potluck footage for his channel, and Deborah's eyes flicked toward him with unmistakable tension, quickly masked. "Tyler, put that away. Sweetheart," she said, voice tight beneath the sweetness. He rolled his eyes but complied, tucking the phone into his pocket. That small flash of tension told me everything I needed. Whatever piece Deborah projected publicly, something underneath remained coiled and watchful. She wasn't finished. Move more carefully, aware perhaps that her usual tactics had started drawing quiet attention. I left the potluck early, kids in tow, banana bread pan tucked under my arm, and drove home with an unshakable feeling that the calm wouldn't last much longer. Sure enough, an envelope waited in my mailbox that same evening. Official HOA letterhead. Deborah's familiar signature below. The notice announced the enclosure mandate's final vote, scheduled 2 weeks out, along with a compliance grace period, ending immediately after. Any household without an approved enclosure installed by deadline would face escalating daily fines, potentially culminating in liens against the property itself. 2 weeks. Feeling the temporary peace evaporate entirely. Whatever quiet Deborah had allowed me these past few weeks, it was strategic. Not kind, time enough for the vendor contracts to finalize. Time enough for her to look procedurally untouchable. I called my attorney friend that same night, forwarding the notice immediately. "This is our window," he said calmly. "Once this vote passes and fines start piling up, you'll have leverage nobody can dismiss as neighborhood pettiness. Get everything ready." The board convened for the final vote on a warm Tuesday evening. Folding chairs filled wall to wall with residents anxious about mandatory enclosure costs, averaging nearly $800 per household, payable exclusively to the single approved vendor listed directly on Deborah's paperwork. The vote passed 12-9. Narrower than Deborah probably expected, though still enough. She gavelled the meeting closed with visible satisfaction, thanking everyone for their commitment to neighborhood standards, while carefully avoiding any mention of who actually owned the newly approved vendor company. Within days, fines began accumulating rapidly. My mailbox filled with notices citing unenclosed waste receptacle violations, $75 daily, compounding weekly per the new bylaws. I calculated the math grimly at my kitchen table, nearly $2,000 within a single month alone. I paid the enclosure vendor a visit myself, curious about pricing and installation timelines. The small storefront, tucked behind a strip mall, listed Meridian Yard Solutions LLC on its sign. County business records, pulled that evening, listed the registered agent as Franklin Prescott. No surprise, but useful confirmation. My attorney filed a formal public records request regarding the vendor approval process, requesting board meeting minutes, vendor bid comparisons, and financial disclosure statements required under our state's HOA transparency statutes. The management company took nearly 3 weeks to respond, citing administrative delays. Meanwhile, Deborah escalated her public messaging, sending a neighborhood-wide email describing certain residents actively undermining community improvement efforts through baseless accusations and harassment of board volunteers. She never named me directly, though everyone reading between the lines understood exactly who she meant. My coworkers noticed my distraction during video calls, and eventually my manager mentioned receiving an anonymous complaint letter about unprofessional conduct in a residential dispute, oddly detailed, oddly specific to information only someone monitoring my HOA situation closely could possibly have known. I suspected immediately who'd sent it. I couldn't prove the complaint traced back to Deborah, though the timing felt impossible to dismiss as coincidence. My manager, thankfully, dismissed it as irrelevant to my actual job performance. But the invasion still rattled me deeply. She'd reached beyond the neighborhood entirely now, into my career. Priya called an informal gathering at her house that weekend, inviting several neighbors quietly rumored to share similar frustrations. 6 households showed up, coffee and folders spread across her dining table, each person recounting eerily familiar patterns, sudden fines, anonymous flyers, escalating pressure after minor pushback. The Alvarez family described nearly identical trash can incidents the previous summer, before eventually installing their own security camera and catching footage remarkably similar to mine. They'd never reported it publicly, embarrassed and unsure anyone would believe accusations against someone so respected in the community. An elderly widow, Mrs. Chen, mentioned Deborah personally recommending a trusted contractor for roof repairs after a fabricated code violation notice. A contractor who turned out to be Frank's cousin, charging nearly double standard market rates for mediocre, barely adequate work. The pattern crystallized further with each story shared around that table. Manufactured violations.
Convenient bandorrafarrals.
Relentless pressure until compliance or departure. Deborah had built an entire quiet economy around intimidation, funneling frightened, exhausted residents directly into businesses connected to her own family. We agreed to pool resources, sharing documentation, splitting attorney consultation costs, coordinating quietly rather than confronting Deborah individually and risking further isolated retaliation. Priya suggested calling it simply the Willowbrook Group. Nothing dramatic, just neighbors finally comparing notes after years of separate, silent suffering. My camera caught fresh footage that same week. Deborah tampering with my recycling bin this time, removing specific paper items before replacing the lid carelessly. Curious, I reviewed the clip closely and noticed she'd taken what looked like torn envelope pieces, oddly deliberate for simple mischief. I mentioned this detail to my attorney, who suggested she might be searching for evidence I'd discarded. Perhaps drafts of complaint letters, correspondence with him, anything revealing how organized my case against her had become. The realization unsettled me. She was actively counter-investigating me now. I started shredding everything sensitive afterward, keeping digital copies exclusively, backed up across encrypted storage. Priya did the same. Did similar precautions collectively, treating our own documentation with the same seriousness Deborah apparently treated her surveillance of us. Tyler approached me unexpectedly one afternoon while I collected mail. Phone tucked away for once. Expression unusually serious for a 16-year-old normally glued to his camera. "Can I talk to you?" he asked quietly, glancing back toward his own house before continuing. He admitted, haltingly, that his mother sometimes asked him to film specific neighbors for documentation, directing exactly which angles, which moments, which context to capture, footage that never appeared publicly, but apparently got saved and referenced during board discussions about violations. "I didn't think it was a big deal at first," Tyler admitted, clearly uncomfortable. "Just helping Mom with HOA stuff. But some of the footage from your house. She asked me to edit out certain parts before showing anyone. That felt wrong." I asked carefully whether he still had the original, unedited files. He hesitated a long moment, then nodded slowly. "On my old laptop, probably. I never cleared the drive. I didn't push further that day, not wanting to pressure a teenager into betraying his own mother. Still, the conversation lingered heavily in my mind. If Tyler's raw footage showed Deborah directing selective, manipulated documentation, it could potentially prove intentional fraud rather than simple neighborhood overzealousness. A critical distinction my attorney had emphasized repeatedly throughout our conversations about actual legal leverage. Days later, our public records request finally returned partial results. Heavily redacted meeting minutes. No vendor bid comparisons whatsoever. And a financial disclosure form listing Deborah's no conflicts of interest despite Frank's clear ownership stake in the newly mandated enclosure vendor. My attorney flagged the missing bid comparisons immediately as a serious red flag, potentially violating state HOA transparency requirements outright. This alone could void the entire mandate, he explained. If we can prove the vendor selection process bypassed required competitive bidding procedures entirely. Emboldened, I drafted a formal written complaint to the state's HOA regulatory division, attaching copies of the incomplete records, alongside a summary timeline of fines, notices, and vendor connections. Priya reviewed every line carefully before I submitted it electronically that same evening. An anonymous note appeared taped to my front door 3 days later. No signature. Block-lettered handwriting. "Some battles aren't worth fighting. Mara. Think about your kids." I photographed it immediately, hands shaking, more from anger now than fear, and forwarded it directly to my attorney. He advised contacting local police to file an official report, establishing documented concern for potential harassment or intimidation, regardless of whether charges ever materialized. The responding officer took my statement seriously, noting the note's language carefully, though admitting proving authorship would prove difficult. Word of the anonymous note spread quickly through the Willowbrook group, several members expressing genuine alarm at the apparent escalation. Mrs. My kids to the bus stop personally each morning, unwilling to let intimidation tactics go unanswered within our small coalition. I appreciated the gesture more than I could properly express, tears threatening as I thanked her at my doorstep. Whatever else this ordeal had cost me, it had also revealed genuine community. Neighbors I'd barely known before, now standing quietly, deliberately, protectively beside me. Meanwhile, I reached out to a local news reporter who'd previously covered HOA disputes elsewhere in the county, forwarding a carefully worded summary alongside select documentation, avoiding unverified speculation. She responded within a day, cautiously interested, requesting additional verification before committing to any story. Deborah, apparently sensing shifting tides within the neighborhood, scheduled an unusual town hall meeting outside the regular board calendar, promoting it as an opportunity for open dialogue and community healing, language that felt distinctly defensive to anyone paying close attention by now. The town hall drew a larger crowd than usual, curiosity clearly outweighing exhaustion for once. Deborah opened with a lengthy, polished speech about neighborhood pride, unity, and the importance of not letting misinformation divide us, never once addressing specific allegations directly or by name. I sat quietly through most of it, watching her navigate the room with practiced confidence, noting how carefully she avoided eye contact with anyone from the Willowbrook group scattered strategically throughout the audience. Priya squeezed my hand once, a silent signal to wait. Not yet. Near the meeting's end, during open floor questions, Mr. Alvarez stood and asked plainly about the enclosure vendor's ownership connections. The room went noticeably quiet. Deborah's smile flickered, just barely, before she recovered smoothly. Frank has minimal involvement, purely administrative. Nothing improper whatsoever. It was, we all now knew, a direct and demonstrable lie. County records clearly listed him as sole registered agent and majority owner. I felt my pulse quicken, torn between speaking up immediately and following the patient strategy my attorney had carefully outlined weeks earlier. I stayed quiet that night, trusting the plan, though it took every ounce of restraint I possessed. Priya later admitted she'd felt the exact same urge, watching Deborah lie so effortlessly to an entire room of people who trusted her judgment without question. Year after year. The following week, our reporter contact confirmed she'd independently verified the vendor ownership records herself, expressing genuine interest in publishing a story once we had additional supporting evidence, ideally something demonstrating intentional, ongoing harassment beyond simple vendor conflicts of interest. That's when I remembered Tyler's mention of unedited footage sitting untouched on an old laptop. I reached out to him carefully through a mutual friend from his skate group, asking gently whether he'd reconsider sharing those files, emphasizing no pressure, no obligation, entirely his choice. He responded 2 days later, agreeing to meet at a coffee shop away from Willowbrook entirely, visibly nervous, glancing toward the door repeatedly throughout our conversation. He'd copied several files onto a flash drive, unsure exactly what they showed, but certain something felt deeply wrong about them. We reviewed the footage together on my laptop that afternoon, and what I saw stole my breath entirely. Deborah, unaware she was being filmed by her own son, coaching him quietly beside my property line. Get the angle where it looks like she left it open on purpose. Multiple clips followed similar patterns, Deborah directing selective framing, occasionally staging minor violations herself before instructing Tyler to photograph them as evidence, then submitting those manufactured images directly into official HOA violation files against various households, including mine. Repeatedly, methodically, I sat frozen at my kitchen table long after Tyler left, staring at footage proving intentional, coordinated fraud rather than simple overzealous rule enforcement. This wasn't misguided community standards anymore. This was deliberate, calculated deception, built carefully over years, targeting real families for reasons I still didn't fully understand. I called my attorney immediately, describing the footage in detail. His voice sharpened with genuine excitement through the phone. "That's it," he said. "Documented. From an unbiased source who has no reason to lie. This changes everything about our timeline and our leverage." We agreed to compile everything: footage, fines, records, testimonies, into a comprehensive package for both the state regulatory complaint and the reporter's story, timing the reveal carefully around the HOA's upcoming annual meeting, where board elections and budget approvals traditionally drew the largest attendance. I felt something shift inside me that week. Exhaustion slowly giving way to something steadier, more determined. Deborah had spent months trying to isolate, exhaust, and outlast me. Instead, she'd inadvertently built an entire coalition of witnesses, evidence, and allies quietly assembling against her. What none of us anticipated, though, was how far Deborah herself would escalate once she sensed the ground shifting beneath her, how quickly quiet manipulation would give way to something far more reckless, far more dangerous. Once she realized her carefully constructed kingdom was finally, truly under threat, Deborah must have sensed something changing, because the harassment intensified almost overnight. My car tires were slashed one morning, all four, parked safely in my own driveway overnight. Police found no witnesses, no camera footage from that particular angle, my one dead zone. I couldn't prove Deborah's involvement directly, though the timing, arriving mere days after the town hall confrontation, felt impossibly convenient. Priya's car suffered identical damage 2 nights later, reinforcing our shared suspicion that someone within the Willowbrook group had been specifically, personally targeted. An anonymous call came into Child Protective Services that same week, alleging neglect at my address based on vague, unspecified concerns from concerned neighbors. A caseworker visited politely, found nothing remotely concerning, closed the case within days, though the fear and humiliation lingered far longer. I sat my kids down that evening, explaining gently that some grown-ups sometimes made poor choices when frightened, without naming Deborah directly, unwilling to burden them with adult conflicts they hadn't caused and couldn't possibly understand. My daughter hugged me tightly, sensing something serious regardless. Priya received a similarly anonymous complaint filed with her former employer's professional licensing board, dredging up a decade-old, thoroughly resolved dispute, apparently hoping to damage her credibility before she could meaningfully contribute testimony against the board. The complaint went nowhere, but the attempt itself spoke volumes. We reported both incidents to the police report file already documenting the earlier threatening note, building an official paper trail regardless of whether individual charges ever materialized. My attorney emphasized patience once more, insisting Deborah's escalating recklessness would ultimately serve our case better than confrontation. Deborah called an emergency board session that week, unusual and hastily scheduled, proposing a motion to strip specific, disruptive members of voting privileges pending investigation into conduct unbecoming of community standards. My name appeared explicitly on the proposed list, alongside Priya's and Mr. Alvarez's. The motion required a supermajority to pass, and to my genuine relief, several board members who'd previously stayed silently compliant finally pushed back publicly, questioning the legality of such sweeping punitive action without clear evidence or formal hearing process first established under our bylaws. The motion failed, 6-5, a narrow margin that clearly rattled Deborah visibly for the first time throughout this entire ordeal. She adjourned the meeting abruptly afterward, declining questions, her usual polished composure cracking just enough for the whole room to notice plainly. Frank's business, I learned through Gerald the mailman, had been struggling financially for months, multiple contracts falling through after competitors underbid. The enclosure vendor pricing, forcing Deborah's household into unexpected pressure precisely as her carefully built scheme threatened to unravel entirely around her. Desperation seemed to sharpen her recklessness further. My security camera caught her directly this time. Late one evening, attempting to physically remove the device itself from my trash can lid, yanking at the housing with obvious frustration before apparently realizing it was bolted securely. The footage showed her muttering something inaudible, glancing nervously toward neighboring houses, before abandoning the attempt and hurrying back across the street. I watched the clip 4 times, stunned that a 50-something HOA president was personally, physically tampering with surveillance equipment on a stranger's property. I forwarded that footage immediately to both my attorney and the local reporter, who responded within the hour, calling it exactly the kind of undeniable, visual proof that transforms a neighborhood dispute story into genuine, publishable investigative journalism worth real editorial attention and resources. Tyler stopped speaking to his mother almost entirely that week, according to a brief, worried message he sent me through our mutual friend. He'd overheard her on the phone with Frank, discussing handling the Ellison situation permanently before he could hear specifics. Deeply frightened by the phrasing, I reassured him as best I could, urging him to stay somewhere safe, maybe with a friend, if things at home felt unstable or threatening in any way. He thanked me, admitting he felt caught impossibly between protecting his mother and doing what he increasingly recognized was right. Deborah, apparently unaware Tyler had already shared footage with me, confronted him directly about missing files from his old laptop, according to what he later described as a frightening, tearful argument that ended with her confiscating his phone entirely for nearly a full week. That confiscation, ironically, only strengthened our case further. Tyler, furious and hurt, provided a signed written statement to my attorney describing his mother's coaching, the selective footage manipulation, and now her attempts to intimidate him into silence about everything he'd witnessed personally over years. My attorney filed an emergency motion with the state regulatory division, attaching Tyler's statement alongside the camera footage of Deborah's attempted tampering, requesting immediate suspension of the enclosure mandate pending full investigation into vendor fraud and coordinated resident harassment across multiple documented households. Deborah, perhaps sensing the walls closing steadily inward, doubled down publicly instead of retreating, sending another neighborhood-wide email accusing a small group of disgruntled residents of orchestrating a coordinated smear campaign rooted in personal jealousy, never once addressing the mounting specific evidence directly. The email backfired spectacularly. Several previously neutral neighbors, reading her increasingly defensive, evasive language, began asking pointed questions of their own within the community Facebook group. Questions Deborah either ignored entirely or answered with vague, unconvincing deflections that satisfied absolutely nobody paying close attention. I received a formal cease and desist letter from Deborah's personal attorney that same week, threatening defamation litigation should I continue spreading false, damaging accusations throughout the community. My own attorney reviewed it calmly, noting its language was mostly bluster, unlikely to hold weight given documented evidence. This is fear-talking, he explained during our call, not confidence. People with strong legal footing rarely threaten this aggressively this early. She's scrambling, trying to intimidate you into silence before the reporter's story publishes, and the regulatory complaint gains real traction against her. Priya suggested we accelerate our timeline slightly, worried that continued escalation might eventually cross from harassment into something genuinely dangerous rather than merely intimidating. My attorney agreed, contacting the reporter to discuss potentially expediting publication ahead of the original planned annual meeting timeline. The reporter, after reviewing everything we'd compiled, footage, testimonies, financial records, the cease and desist letter itself, confirmed her editor had approved the story for publication within the week, pending one final round of fact-checking calls, including a formal request for Deborah's comment. Deborah, contacted directly by the reporter for comment, reportedly grew visibly agitated during the phone call, according to what the reporter later described to me, denying everything categorically before abruptly hanging up mid-sentence, refusing any further questions or clarification whatsoever from that point forward. That refusal, predictably, only strengthened the story's credibility rather than weakening it. Within journalism, declining comment on documented evidence rarely reads as innocence to careful readers. The reporter noted this dynamic explicitly within her drafted article, alongside every piece of evidence we'd carefully assembled. Meanwhile, my camera caught one final, reckless act from Deborah, arriving well past midnight this time, gloved hands visible in the footage, attempting to plant what appeared to be a bag of loose trash directly beside my enclosure lesson, presumably staging a fresh violation. She hadn't accounted for the camera's improved night vision capability, purchased weeks earlier specifically for this possibility. The footage captured her face with startling clarity, timestamp glowing steadily in the corner, undeniable proof of exactly the kind of manufactured evidence Tyler had already described under signed statement. I sent that final clip immediately to my attorney, to the reporter, and to the state regulatory investigator now formally assigned to our complaint. Within days, the investigator scheduled a formal interview, requesting my complete evidence file alongside sworn statements from myself, Priya, Tyler, and Mr. Alvarez. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood grapevine that state investigators had begun formally examining HOA vendor contracts and enforcement practices. Deborah's usual composure, so carefully maintained across 19 years of neighborhood authority, began visibly crumbling under mounting public scrutiny she could no longer control or contain. She stopped attending the community Facebook group entirely, stopped walking her poodle past my house on schedule, stopped sending her usual barrage of violation notices altogether. The silence felt strange after months of relentless pressure, though nobody in the Willowbrook group mistook it for genuine surrender yet. Frank's business lost its exclusive HOA contract that same week, the board voting unanimously, including, notably, several members previously loyal to Deborah, to suspend the enclosure mandate entirely pending investigation outcomes, a direct financial blow neither of them could easily absorb. I heard through Gerald that Deborah had begun making desperate calls to other board members, apparently attempting to shift blame entirely onto Frank. claiming she'd been unaware of his ownership stake despite 19 years of marriage and years of jointly signed financial documents proving otherwise conclusively. That particular lie unraveled almost immediately once county marriage and property records surfaced publicly, definitively establishing joint ownership across multiple shared business ventures dating back over a decade. Whatever thin credibility Deborah retained within the neighborhood evaporated rapidly once that specific deception became undeniable. The annual HOA meeting, originally scheduled as a routine budget and election session, was now approaching under circumstances nobody could have predicted 6 months earlier, an investigation underway, a news story pending publication, a coalition of harassed residents ready finally to speak plainly and publicly. The news story published 3 days before the annual meeting, headlined plainly, HOA president accused of fabricating violations, steering contracts to husband's business. My name appeared, alongside Priya's and Mr. Alvarez's, credited openly for the first time throughout this entire exhausting ordeal. The article spread quickly through local social media, shared hundreds of times within our county alone, comment sections filling with similar stories from other neighborhoods describing eerily familiar HOA power struggles. Deborah's name trended briefly within our small regional news cycle, impossible now to ignore. My phone buzzed constantly that day, neighbors reaching out with support, some apologizing quietly for staying silent too long themselves, admitting fear of similar retaliation had kept them compliant despite recognizing something was clearly, deeply wrong within our community's leadership for years. Deborah issued a brief, carefully worded statement through her attorney denying any wrongdoing whatsoever, describing the allegations as a coordinated effort by disgruntled residents to damage her reputation. Nobody within the Willowbrook group found the statement remotely convincing given everything already documented publicly. I spent the days before the annual meeting organizing our presentation carefully alongside Priya and my attorney, deciding exactly which footage to show, which documents to distribute, which testimonies to read aloud, ensuring nothing came across as vindictive rather than simply, plainly factual and thorough. Mr. appeared to formally submit the recall petition we'd quietly circulated over recent weeks, now carrying signatures from nearly 70% of eligible households, well beyond the 60% threshold required under our bylaws to force an emergency board leadership vote. Tyler asked whether he could attend the meeting himself, wanting to speak briefly about what he'd witnessed and experienced firsthand. I told him the decision belonged entirely to him, that nobody expected or required his participation, though his voice would carry undeniable weight given his position. He decided to attend, moving temporarily to stay with his older sister across town, unwilling to remain under his mother's roof during what promised to be an emotionally difficult, publicly consequential confrontation neither of them could avoid or postpone any longer at this point. The state regulatory investigator confirmed she'd also be present at the meeting, an unusual step, though she explained it was standard procedure given the volume and severity of documented complaints now formally under her active, ongoing investigation into our HOA's leadership and vendor practices. Priya and I reviewed our footage compilation one final time the night before, condensing months of documentation into roughly 15 minutes of the clearest, most damning clips: Deborah tipping cans, planting trash, coaching Tyler, tampering with cameras, each timestamp undeniable and precisely sequential. I barely slept that night, mind racing through every possible outcome, every way Deborah might attempt to spin or deflect what was coming. My kids sensed my nervousness at breakfast, My daughter offering an encouraging hug before school, telling me simply, "You're brave, Mom." Gerald mentioned during his morning route that Deborah's house had been unusually quiet lately. Blinds drawn, mail piling slightly, Frank's truck notably absent for several consecutive days. Whether preparing her defense or simply avoiding public scrutiny entirely, nobody within the neighborhood seemed entirely certain. The community center parking lot filled unusually early that evening, cars lining the surrounding streets well before the meeting's official start time. Word had clearly spread widely. This would be the largest attendance Willow Creek Estates had witnessed in the community's entire 19-year history. I arrived with Priya, my folder of printed evidence tucked securely under my arm, flash drive backup in my pocket, attorney walking calmly beside us. My hands trembled slightly despite months of preparation, adrenaline mixing uncomfortably with the sheer, overwhelming weight of this particular moment. Inside, folding chairs stretched wall to wall, easily twice the usual attendance. Extra rows hastily added along the back near the entrance doors. Mrs. near the front for our group, waving us over warmly the moment we stepped through the doorway. Deborah entered precisely at 7. Frank notably absent beside her for the first time in years, her usual polished composure visibly strained beneath a thin, practiced smile that no longer quite reached her eyes the way it always had throughout 19 confident, unquestioned years of leadership. She took her customary seat at the head table, gaveling the meeting to order with a steadiness that seemed increasingly effortful, glancing occasionally toward the investigator seated quietly near the side wall, notepad open, expression carefully neutral throughout the entire proceeding thus far. The regular agenda items moved quickly: budget approval, landscaping updates, minor procedural votes, everyone in the room clearly waiting, restless, for the moment that truly mattered tonight. Deborah stretched the routine items longer than necessary, perhaps hoping to delay the inevitable confrontation somehow. Finally, Mr. Alvarez stood, requesting the floor to formally present the recall petition. Thick binder of signatures raised visibly for the entire room to witness. Deborah's expression flickered, composure cracking just slightly, before she nodded stiffly, gesturing for him to proceed with obvious reluctance. He read the petition's language aloud clearly, citing repeated harassment, fabricated violations, undisclosed vendor conflicts of interest, and documented intimidation tactics against multiple households. The room fell completely silent. 70% of eligible signatures already secured, meeting the bylaw threshold decisively and undeniably. Deborah attempted to interject, insisting procedural review was required before formal acceptance. Though the board's parliamentarian, a normally quiet accountant named Mr. Suarez, confirmed calmly that the petition met every documented requirement outlined explicitly within their own established governing bylaws already on record. I felt Priya's hand find mine under the table, steady and reassuring, as the room's energy shifted palpably, tension building toward something neither Deborah nor anyone else in that packed room could delay or redirect much longer at this particular, decisive point in the proceedings. The investigator raised her hand politely, requesting permission to briefly address the room regarding the state's ongoing formal investigation, confirming publicly for the first time that multiple complaints had been substantiated with documented evidence, including footage, financial records, and multiple sworn witness statements. Deborah's face drained visibly of color as the investigator spoke plainly, professionally, without embellishment, simply stating facts already gathered through months of careful, methodical work. Murmurs rippled steadily through the crowd, neighbors exchanging glances, finally hearing official confirmation of what many had quietly suspected. I stood then, folder in hand, requesting the floor formally to present our documentation directly to the community. Deborah's eyes met mine briefly across the room, something unreadable flickering there. Fear, perhaps, or fury, or simply the exhausted recognition that her careful control was ending. My voice shook slightly at first, though it steadied quickly as I began walking the room through our timeline, the trash can incidents, the fines, the anonymous flyers, Carol Whitfield's story, the vendor connections, Tyler's coached footage, and finally, Deborah's own captured attempts at tampering. I played the footage on the community center's projector screen, each clip landing heavier than the last across the silent, packed room. Deborah's face, captured clearly tipping my trash can, planting evidence, yanking at my camera housing, appeared larger than life for everyone present finally to witness. The room's collective silence broke into a low, steady murmur of disbelief and quiet anger. Dozens of neighbors finally seeing undeniable, visual proof of exactly what several among them had quietly suspected or personally experienced themselves across recent years without ever having concrete evidence to confront her. Deborah rose abruptly from her seat, voice cracking as she insisted the footage was manipulated, taken out of context, her composure finally shattering entirely in front of the very community she'd controlled so completely and effortlessly for nearly 2 decades of unquestioned local authority. Out of context? Mr. Alvarez called out from his seat, voice sharp with restrained anger. You're literally shoving trash bags out of the can with your own 2 hands. Deborah. There's no context that explains that away. Scattered applause rippled through the crowded room immediately. Tyler stood then, visibly shaking, moving toward the front of the room despite his mother's sharp, pleading glance in his direction. Mom, I have to say something, he said quietly, voice trembling but clear enough to carry across the now completely silent community center. He described, haltingly at first then with growing steadiness, the coaching, the selective editing, the confiscated phone, the frightened phone call he'd overheard about handling the situation permanently. The room's murmur turned to audible gasps, several neighbors covering their mouths in genuine shock. Deborah's expression crumbled watching her own son speak publicly against her, something raw and genuinely pained crossing her features for the first time throughout this entire ordeal. Momentarily human beneath months of calculated manipulation and carefully constructed neighborhood authority now visibly disintegrating completely. Tyler, please, she said quietly, reaching toward him. He stepped back gently, not unkindly, but firmly. I love you, Mom. But I can't keep lying for you. Not anymore. Scene. His voice broke slightly on the final words, genuine and unrehearsed. Priya stood next, presenting Mrs. Chen's roofing contractor story, the Alvarez family's earlier trash can experience, and her own decade-long documentation of Deborah's escalating tactics dating back to their original fence dispute years earlier, establishing an unmistakable, methodical pattern spanning far longer than anyone realized. Mrs. Voice quavering slightly with age and emotion. describing the fabricated roof violation and Frank's cousin's overpriced, substandard repair work. "I trusted her," she said simply. 19 years. And I trusted her completely. I never imagined any of this. The board's parliamentarian, Mr. Suarez, called for an immediate procedural vote given the overwhelming, documented evidence now presented publicly, alongside the already verified recall petition signatures. Several previously silent board members finally spoke up, admitting quietly they'd long suspected irregularities they'd been too intimidated to investigate. "I should have pushed back sooner," one board member admitted publicly, visibly ashamed. Deborah made it very clear that questioning her decisions meant becoming her next target. "I'm sorry to everyone who suffered because the rest of us stayed quiet out of fear." Deborah attempted one final defense, insisting the vendor arrangement had saved the community money and that her enforcement methods, while perhaps occasionally overzealous, had always served the neighborhood's genuine best interests. The room's response was immediate, scattered, incredulous laughter mixed with open frustration. "Overzealous," I said, stepping forward again, unable to hold back any longer. "You tipped my trash can 11 times. You called Child Protective Services on my family. You slashed my tires," with an anonymous note. "That's not overzealous. That's cruelty." The room fell completely silent again, my voice carrying clearly across the packed space. Months of accumulated exhaustion and fear finally given full, public voice. Deborah opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently finding no adequate defense remaining for that particular accusation. Frank appeared suddenly at the community center's entrance, visibly disheveled, having apparently rushed over upon learning what was unfolding. He moved quickly toward Deborah, placing a protective hand on her shoulder, though his own expression suggested he understood exactly how deeply this had spiraled. "Deb, we need to leave," he said quietly, though not quietly enough to avoid the room's attention entirely. She shook her head stubbornly, gripping the podium tightly, unwilling apparently to abandon her position even as the evidence against her mounted overwhelmingly before an entire community. The parliamentarian called for the formal recall vote, reading the petition's language aloud once more for official record. Hands rose steadily across the packed room, overwhelming and immediate, well beyond even the required threshold. Dozens upon dozens of neighbors voting decisively to remove Deborah entirely. The final count came back staggering. 218 votes in favor of recall, only 4 opposed. Deborah's face, watching the numbers announced aloud, seemed to age visibly in that single moment. 19 years of carefully constructed authority collapsing completely within one decisive, public evening. She stood frozen at the podium for a long, heavy moment, silence stretching uncomfortably across the packed room, before finally stepping back, gathering her folder with trembling hands, refusing to meet anyone's eyes directly as Frank guided her gently toward the exit doors. "This isn't over," she said quietly near the doorway, voice barely audible, though nobody in the room seemed particularly moved or frightened by the statement anymore. Whatever authority those words once carried had evaporated entirely, replaced now by something closer to quiet, deserved pity. The investigator approached me afterward, requesting formal copies of everything I'd presented, confirming the state's investigation would now expand significantly given the public testimony and overwhelming documented evidence presented tonight before dozens upon dozens of credible community witnesses across multiple corroborating households. Priya hugged me tightly once the crowd began dispersing, both of us finally allowing exhaustion and relief to wash over us simultaneously after months of careful, quiet, methodical preparation finally culminating in this single, decisive, overwhelming public evening of long overdue accountability and vindication. Tyler approached quietly afterward, eyes red, clearly emotionally drained from the evening's events. "Thank you for not making me feel like a villain," he said softly. I hugged him too, telling him honestly that his courage tonight had mattered enormously to everyone in that room. Mr. An interim board president would be appointed within the week, alongside a formal timeline for new elections, promising complete transparency. Moving forward regarding vendor contracts, financial disclosures, and enforcement procedures, everything Deborah had carefully obscured throughout her lengthy tenure. I drove home that night in a strange, quiet daze, adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by something closer to disbelief that months of quiet documentation, careful patience, and unexpected community solidarity had actually, genuinely worked exactly as we'd hoped throughout this entire exhausting ordeal. My kids were asleep when I arrived, the babysitter reporting an uneventful evening, blissfully unaware of everything unfolding across town that night. I checked on them both quietly, watching them sleep peacefully, grateful beyond words that this chapter of manufactured fear was finally, truly ending. The following morning brought a flood of messages. Neighbors thanking me, apologizing for their earlier silence, sharing their own long-suppressed stories, now finally feeling safe enough to voice publicly. The community Facebook group buzzed steadily with conversations that would have seemed impossible mere weeks earlier. Deborah's name disappeared entirely from official HOA correspondence within days, her signature replaced by Mr. Suarez's on all subsequent notices. The enclosure mandate was formally suspended pending full investigation. Existing fines against multiple households quietly reversed and refunded across the following several weeks. Frank's business lost its remaining contracts entirely within the month, several other neighborhoods reportedly reviewing their own vendor arrangements after hearing about Willow Creek's public reckoning through regional news coverage that continued expanding steadily throughout the following weeks and months. I finally removed my hidden camera from the trash can lid roughly 2 weeks later. No longer necessary given everything that had unfolded so decisively and publicly. Kept it though, tucked carefully in a drawer. A strange, small souvenir from the strangest chapter of my life. Still, one final piece remained unresolved, the state investigation's formal conclusions, alongside whatever consequences Deborah might ultimately face beyond simple community removal. Questions that would take several more weeks to fully, officially, satisfyingly resolve themselves before this entire ordeal could truly be called finished. The State Regulatory Division released its formal findings 6 weeks later, confirming extensive violations, fraudulent vendor bidding, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and a documented pattern of retaliatory harassment against multiple households, including fabricated evidence submitted knowingly into official HOA violation records repeatedly. Deborah faced substantial civil penalties, alongside a permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association board within the state. A rare and severe sanction the investigator later told me was reserved specifically for the most egregious, clearly documented cases of systematic abuse. Frank's business, Prescott Waste Solutions, lost its state licensing entirely following a separate investigation into the fraudulent contracting practices, effectively ending the company altogether after years of quiet, comfortable operation built substantially on exactly the kind of intimidation tactics now fully exposed publicly. I learned through Gerald that Deborah and Frank had listed their house for sale within the month. Quietly, without the usual neighborhood announcement or farewell gathering she'd once insisted on for every departing family throughout her many years as the community's self-appointed social gatekeeper. Tyler chose to stay with his sister permanently, enrolling at a nearby school for his final year, occasionally messaging me updates, cautiously optimistic about rebuilding his relationship with his mother eventually, though clearly still processing everything he'd witnessed and courageously helped expose that difficult evening. Carol Whitfield, the previous owner of my house, reached out unexpectedly through a message Priya helped track down, having seen the regional news coverage from across the country. "I always wondered if anyone would finally catch her," she wrote. "I'm glad it was someone as thorough as you." We exchanged several messages over subsequent weeks, Carol finally sharing her own full story, the vendor kickbacks she'd discovered years earlier, Deborah's furious reaction, the quiet threats that ultimately convinced her selling and relocating was simply easier than fighting a battle she felt certain she'd lose. "You did something I couldn't," Carol admitted honestly. "You had proof, allies, and apparently more patience than I ever managed. I'm grateful, truly, that this house finally got the ending it deserved." Her words settled something quietly satisfying within me, a strange, unexpected sense of closure. The Willowbrook Group evolved naturally into an informal neighborhood watch and support network, regularly meeting for coffee, sharing updates, occasionally still comparing notes on new board decisions, though the atmosphere had shifted entirely from fearful vigilance toward genuine, comfortable, hard-earned community solidarity. Mr. Elected formally as permanent HOA president the following month, implemented transparent vendor bidding processes, published financial disclosures, and established a formal appeals process for violation notices, ensuring the kind of unchecked, unilateral authority Deborah once wielded could never quietly happen again. My fines were formally reversed and refunded within weeks, alongside a written apology from the board acknowledging the documented harassment I'd experienced. Felt strange, receiving an official apology for something so exhausting and deeply personal, though undeniably validating after everything my family had endured. My daughter's classmate, whose mother had once repeated Deborah's careless, messy house comment, approached her at school with a genuine, unprompted apology weeks later. Small moments like that, quietly restoring dignity piece by piece, mattered more to me than any formal HOA correspondence ever could. I ran into Deborah once more before she moved away entirely. Unexpectedly, at the grocery store, both of us pausing awkwardly near the produce section. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of her usual polished authority, eyes tired in a way I genuinely never witnessed throughout our entire ordeal. "I hope you're happy," she said quietly, though without her old venom, more resigned than accusatory. I considered several responses before settling on simple honesty. "I just wanted to be left alone, Deborah. That's all I ever wanted. From the very beginning of all this." She nodded slowly, something unreadable crossing her face, before turning and walking away without further words exchanged between us. I stood there a long moment afterward, feeling not triumphant exactly, but genuinely, quietly relieved that this particular chapter had finally, truly reached its natural end. The moving truck appeared at Deborah and Frank's house 3 weeks later. Neighbors watching quietly from porches and windows, nobody gathering to wave goodbye the way they once had for every other departing family under her careful, curated social direction throughout 19 controlling years. I didn't feel cruel satisfaction watching them go. Exactly, though I won't pretend the relief wasn't genuine and significant. Mostly I felt tired, in the good way, the way you feel after finally setting down something impossibly heavy you'd been carrying far longer than you should have. Priya and I toasted quietly on her porch that evening. Cheap wine in mismatched glasses, watching the sunset settle gently over Willowbrook Lane. To trash cans, she said, laughing, raising her glass. Who knew something so ordinary could expose something so genuinely, thoroughly rotten? I laughed too. Genuinely, for what felt like the first time in months without underlying tension or exhaustion coloring the moment entirely. My kids played nearby in Priya's yard, carefree and unaware of just how much quiet, deliberate work had gone into restoring that simple, ordinary peace. A new family moved into Deborah's old house within 2 months. Friendly and unassuming, immediately welcomed by an entirely different kind of neighborhood gathering than the ones Deborah once orchestrated so carefully. Genuine, warm, and refreshingly free of any hidden agenda whatsoever. 6 months later, Willow Creek Estates felt like an entirely different community. HOA meetings shorter, friendlier, genuinely collaborative. Violation notices rare and reasonable, arriving only when actually warranted rather than weaponized for personal or financial gain by anyone in a position of quiet authority. Tyler visited occasionally over school breaks, eventually reconciling cautiously with his mother, though he told me honestly he'd never regret speaking up that night, regardless of how difficult and painful that particular choice had ultimately been for their fractured, still healing family relationship. My attorney mentioned, months later, that our case had become something of a quiet reference point for other HOA disputes across the region. Several neighborhoods, reportedly citing our documentation methods and community coalition strategy when confronting similarly troubling leadership patterns within their own associations. I still keep that old hidden camera in my kitchen drawer, a strange keepsake from an exhausting, unexpected chapter of my life. Sometimes I take it out, turn it over in my hands, remembering just how much courage it eventually took to simply stand quietly, patiently firm. My kids barely remember the trash ghost anymore. The whole ordeal fading gently into distant memory, the way childhood fears often do once genuinely, thoroughly resolved. I remember every detail though, grateful daily for neighbors who became genuine friends through an entirely unexpected shared struggle. Looking back now, I never wanted to become the woman who exposed her own HOA president. I just wanted my trash can left alone, my family left in peace, my ordinary, quiet life free from someone else's need for constant, unchecked control over everyone around her. But sometimes standing your ground quietly, patiently, and thoroughly matters more than any dramatic confrontation ever could. Deborah underestimated exactly how far quiet persistence, careful documentation, and genuine community solidarity could reach once enough people finally, collectively decided enough truly was enough. Willow Creek Estates moved forward, stronger and more honest than before, built now on transparency rather than fear. And every Thursday morning, My trash can still sits exactly where I leave it, upright, undisturbed, and entirely, finally, peacefully my own.